Hey everyone, can y'all hear me? We're still waiting on one panelist, so we're gonna get started in like 2 minutes, hopefully. Or we might get started soon.
Awesome. Good evening, everyone. So great to see a packed house today. How are you doing? Okay, nice, amazing. All right, welcome. Welcome to the People's Forum. We are a space for political education and cultural work. My name is Saidi. I'm the education coordinator, and I'm really excited to welcome you all today to our book talk with Silky Shah, Unbuild Walls, Why Immigrant Justice Needs Abolition. And without further ado, welcome Silky, welcome everyone, and I'll pass it over to you.
Hi everyone. It's nice to see all of you. Oh my gosh. Okay, so I'm gonna welcome us, so welcome here. I think folks know this already, but we're sitting on the traditional lands of the Lenape peoples whose ancestors have resided here since time immemorial. And I'd like to extend our gratitude to the indigenous stewards of this land. For those of you who don't know me, I know a lot of you, but some of you I don't know. My name is Silky Shah. I'm the executive director of Detention Watch Network. I also have this recently published book, Unbuild Walls, which came out last week. And we're going to spend the next hour and a half or so talking both about, I'm going to tell you a bit about the book, but we're also going to talk a little bit about the work here in New York and New Jersey, which has been so inspiring to me. Personally, it feels very significant to start this book launch in New York for me. When I started working at Detention Watch Network 15 years ago now, I actually was living in New York City, and I was learning so much. I'm originally from Texas, you can read about in the book, but I was learning so much about the intersections of the criminal legal system and immigration from organizations that are in the room, Families for Freedom, Immigrant Defense Project, American Friends Service Committee, and so many others. Alina, of course, was one of them. And I feel like, so much of what I learned during that time informed a lot of some of the lessons in this book and some of the things that helped me kind of understand the system over time. So I'm excited to get into that. I'm also really excited because we have this really powerhouse panel here that I was like, oh my gosh, this is exactly the people that I want to be in conversation with. So I'm going to introduce you to our panelists, and then I'm going to do like a 10-minute overview of the book, and then we're going to get into some conversation about some of the history of organizing here and also sort of like some of the things that we're facing and where we want to go. And we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A. And then we'll wrap up, hopefully a little before 8. So it won't keep you here all night. So first, here with me is Alina Das, who is an immigrant rights attorney. Woo. She is an immigrant rights attorney, activist, and James Weldon Johnson professor at NYU School of Law. Alina is the co-director of the NYU Immigrant Rights Clinic, a leading institution in national and local struggles for immigrant rights. She defends the rights of immigrants facing deportation and partners with community groups on immigrant rights campaigns. And her legal scholarship has been published by leading law journals and cited by the US Supreme Court. She's also the author of No Justice in the Shadows, How America Criminalizes Immigrants, which I highly, highly recommend. I think it's a very complimentary book, so highly recommend that. Next we have here Tania Matos, a proud Aymara descendant born in Bolivia and raised in Queens, New York. And she's a seasoned organizer, activist, and policy advocate with over 13 years of dedicated service as a founding member of Abolish ICE New York, New Jersey, established in 2018 to galvanize efforts to end ICE detention in both states, which we're going to get into. Moreover, she has recently won a 3-decade-long fight to stay in the United States with the support of Unlocal, an immigration legal organization she now leads as the interim executive director. Fueled by her rich cultural heritage and upbringing in Queens, Tania draws inspiration from her from unwavering commitment to organizing, fostering leadership, and striving for freedom within all impacted communities. Yay, Tania. Then we have here Sofia Gurule. Sofia Elena Gurule is a member of the Association of Legal Aid Attorneys, UAW Local 2325, as well as an organizer with Critical Resistance and UAW Labor for Palestine. She is also a senior staff attorney and senior policy counsel to the immigration practice at the Bronx Defenders, where she defends people in ICE detention facing deportation, as well as advocates for policies to protect criminalized working class immigrant communities from ICE enforcement. Woohoo! Man Mohapatra here at the end is a writer, organizer, and artist originally from India, based on Kanarsi land, whose work involves building capacity for abolitionist organizing through political education, participatory research, and direct action. In particular, her work focuses on ending pretrial detention by resourcing criminalized and imprisoned people to organize themselves while creating opportunities for collaboration on anti-carceral strategies across feminist, anti-caste, and anti-capitalist movements. Mon was a founding coordinator of the No New Jails Network, a national network of campaigns fighting new jail construction and to close old jails without expanding supervision and social control. So welcome on. Hopefully that gives you a little bit of a sense of why I'm so excited about this panel tonight. I feel like all 4 of these individuals helped with the book in some way, which is amazing, and have informed a lot of the lessons in it and the work that we continue to do. So I'm excited to get into it. But before we do that, I want to tell you a little bit about this book, Unbuild Walls, Why Immigrant Justice Needs Abolition. So basically, my entire goal with this book was to make a case for abolition. And in this context, specifically prison abolition. And I do it in a few ways. I'm going to lay out 3 of them for y'all just to kind of get a sense of, it's not all the things. Don't worry, this will not be super long. But so first I share the history of the system in order to show that immigration enforcement and the prison industrial complex are fully intertwined, and that the same logic that resulted in mass incarceration has also resulted in mass detention and mass deportation. The second way is explaining how reformist approaches have not only served to expand detention and deportation, but have pitted communities against each other, which doesn't actually help any of us. The last point is to show how a better understanding of these intersections and an abolitionist lens have helped us curb deportations and detentions of immigrants currently living in the United States and have actually gotten us closer to protecting immigrant communities, but also a lot more we need to do, which we'll talk about in the next hour. So on the first point, how are these systems intertwined? Perhaps the most obvious connection is that the roots of these systems trace back to anti-Black racism. The modern detention system as we know it began in the early 1980s with the arrival of Haitian and Afro-Cuban migrants in South Florida. The US began indefinitely detaining Haitians in large numbers, deeming them economic migrants not worthy of asylum. Many advocates and political leaders, like Reverend Jesse Jackson, began to question the systemic detention of Haitians, and in order to make it seem less racist, rather than releasing Haitians, the government started applying a policy of de facto mandatory detention to broader categories of people, which at the time was largely Central American migrants fleeing US-backed wars in the region. So it was the logic of anti-Black racism and racism more generally that actually served to create and expand the detention system. It was also during this period that the war on drugs was in full swing. Tough on crime laws were flourishing in both state and federal levels. More and more people were being locked up, and the system started to really snowball. INS, the Immigration and Naturalization Service, you don't know that, prior to 9/11, had often been using federal prison capacity to detain immigrants. But with the lack of space due to growing numbers of people in the prison system, INS started building and contracting its own facilities and became a mass jailer in its own right. We also start to see these intersections playing out in federal legislation. In 1988, the Anti-Drug Abuse Act, which officially legalizes mandatory detention of immigrants for certain crimes, the list of which continues to expand over the next decade. And, we can talk more about mandatory detention. I highly recommend Alina's book for that. But mandatory detention law essentially eliminates due process for broad groups of people. There's also, of course, the political economy of these systems, like the prison boom in which economically challenged rural communities began to see prison building as a form of economic development. The same theories were applied to the expansion of immigrant detention. Anti-prison advocate Tracy Hewling notes that from 1990 to 1999, 245 prisons were built in rural and small-town communities, with a prison opening somewhere in rural America every 15 days. In the immigration context, this of course included the private prison industry, which is a gross byproduct of neoliberalism, but it also included many counties and localities vying for detention contracts in order to supplement local budgets with federal money. And the federal government eventually bankrolled some county jail expansion to warehouse more immigrants. And the last point I want to make on this sort of intertwined connection of these systems is related to national security frameworks, which started to take shape in federal policy in the 1990s and expanded considerably after 9/11. While the war on terror is understood as a huge injection of resources and capital towards US militarism, the domestic war on terror often worked through the criminal legal system and became an extension of the war on crime. So this meant more detention, more prisons, more policing at the border especially. And because of this, by 2004, immigration crimes became the most prosecuted offense in the federal courts. So that's the very quick summary of how it's intertwined, which is a lot. This is part of the argument. Like, these are the same systems. This is why we have to go after the whole system and not just focus on separating, per se. The second point I want to highlight is the ways that reformist approaches, which are often informed by the idea of the good immigrant versus bad immigrant, have only resulted in more detention and more deportation, and also more divisions between our movements. In chapter 2, I unpack how this played out under the Obama administration. What was so damaging about that time under Obama was that he and his administration continuously affirmed the argument that immigration itself is a public safety issue. It is not a public safety issue. Immigration is about family relationships, labor and work, and of course about seeking refuge. In the Obama administration's line of thinking, immigrants with criminal convictions were the core problem, and our way to fix the system was to get better at targeting those immigrants who had encountered the criminal legal system. And in order to basically make the case for those who hadn't encountered the criminal legal system. Through programs like Secure Communities, the Obama administration more closely linked ICE with local jails, bringing more and more people into the system. So, through these reforms, Obama became, quote unquote, deporter-in-chief. And more formal deportations took place during those years than under any other president. And I think this particular distinction around formal deportations is one I want to unpack for a second. So formal deportations or removals mean that people who are deported this way have a 5-year bar to re-enter the country. And if they do try to re-enter and are caught by Border Patrol and prosecuted, they could get anywhere from 2 years to 20 years in federal prison. This is a system that is essentially handed over to Trump. And then the Trump administration uses the carceral apparatus at the border, which has become that much more robust, to carry out systemic family separations in 2018. But it wasn't just Obama or the Democrats that played up the good versus bad immigrant frame. The mainstream parts of the immigrant rights movement, and especially lobbyists in DC, used it to support the push for comprehensive immigration reform, which I write about in chapter 4. The logic of comprehensive immigration reform means trading off border militarization and more criminalization of migrants for mass legalization of the 11 million undocumented people living in the US. In order to make their case, Beltway groups emphasize immigrants as exceptional and as especially productive and patriotic and relatively innocent. Often they leaned on the argument that immigrants commit less crimes than US citizens. And in fact, many immigrant rights advocates make this argument repeatedly without any critique of the criminal legal system or understanding of the anti-Black racism that underlies such comparisons. This sort of framing really ends up pitting working class communities against each other. It's like the model minority myth, which is often applied to Asian Americans. If there is a model minority, then there is an implied non-model minority that is perceived as inferior and therefore disposable. So now a little bit of the hope part, which we're going to get to a lot more. So lastly, I show how having a better understanding of the relationship between the prison industrial complex and immigration enforcement and embracing abolition has actually helped us start winning campaigns. A good example of this is the proliferation of sanctuary policies here in New York, also in New Jersey, because of Obama's use of the criminal legal system and the growing Black Lives Matter movement. Immigrant justice activists started to have a better understanding of how the criminal legal system collaborates with ICE. As a result of grassroots organizing and advocacy, many localities and states blocked ICE's ability to target immigrants through the criminal system, bringing formal deportations down considerably. And we have not seen those go back up to the level they were during the Obama administration. It's an important win to keep in mind. On immigrant detention specifically, and we can talk more about that in the next hour, for years the advocacy community focused on improving conditions and pushed for alternatives. But the system kept growing and people kept dying and things did not get better. So in the book, I document shutdown efforts around family detention in the Midwest and in California, and of course, here in New York and New Jersey, which we'll be speaking at length about. After we took on a more abolitionist approach to shut down detention centers and defund ICE, and after the social and cultural shifts in light of the uprisings for Black lives in 2020, we start to actually win shutdown campaigns. And in the last 5 years, some 20 detention centers are no longer in use by ICE because of these efforts. So together, all these points are meant to clarify why abolition is not just practical, but actually essential to our struggles for racial and migrant justice, and I hope the book is a resource for sort of examining that and figuring it out. But with that said, I want us to actually unpack a campaign that I think is probably, when you write a book, there's a lot of things in it. It's a lot of work. I have to say one of my favorite case studies is the work that happened here in New York City and in New Jersey to end not just one, but many contracts for ICE detention. And I want us to, I think there's so many pieces of this story that are important because it's both the story about sort of resilience and persevering even whenever there are losses, but also it's a story about how the nonprofit system actually, because of the way it's reformist, many groups were actually against ending contracts at these detention centers and sort of applied this idea of carceral humanism, which is something that comes from our comrade James Kilgore, where people actually see jails as sites of social service provision, and therefore we're making the people that we work with, we're constantly making the case to keep these facilities open. But over time, we actually saw a real shift of those folks, and I think it's a really, really beautiful story. So I want to kind of hear from everybody here. We're going to actually just go down the line. But I first, Alina's been working on these issues for many, many years, and there's a lot of context to going into this. So I wanted to see if you could tell us a little bit about your perspective on the background of the Hudson County jail fight.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. My name's Alina Das, and as Silky mentioned, I teach the Immigrant Rights Clinic at NYU. And I just wanted to start by saying how amazed I am by this beautiful book that everyone should read. Silky has been such a leader in this movement for so long and has really helped transform the immigrant rights movement to one that is embracing abolition so much more. And I'm also thrilled to be on this panel with these incredible freedom fighters who you're going to hear more about the work that they all did to make some of these successes a reality. So thank you for inviting me here. I thought I would let the folks here actually tell the real story of some of the battles that have been happening in New York and New Jersey, but just take the opportunity to provide some context because as somebody who represents immigrants, but also teaches about immigration law, I think in the course of really learning about the system, it's become very apparent to me that the US immigration system has been built both on bad intentions, but also good intentions. And I think that is why Silky's work to really center abolition is so incredibly important. We're not going to talk about the whole history of immigration detention, but even if you look back, to Ellis Island as a detention center here in the US, part of the reason it came about was very bad intentions of preventing people from coming in, screening people for all of the reasons that are based on anti-Blackness, racism, xenophobia, essentially every ism that's part of the foundation of our immigration system. But it was also based on that same kind of the quote-unquote good intentions, the reform, not wanting people to be on ships for a very long time, charities in New York feeling overwhelmed by having to support people, shouldn't the federal government step in? So I think that is language that really resonates with today, the conversation that's happening in New York City, and something that we have to remind ourselves. But fast forwarding way up to New York over the last few years, I started representing immigrants, when I was a law student, so 22 years ago. The first person that I represented was a man who's a lawful permanent resident, green card holder, facing deportation for a single conviction. And when his wife came to pick him up from finishing his 6-month sentence, excited to bring him home with a party waiting at home, she found out, and he found out for the first time that he was being transferred. And he was transferred, this was in the early 2000s, to Oakdale, a large detention federal facility in Louisiana that is one of the facilities that was built in response to Haitian and Cuban asylum seekers, this kind of reaction that Silky details so well in her book, this racist reaction, a carceral reaction as part of the war on drugs and all of the other influences at the time. And the reason I'm just starting there very quickly is because during that time, one of the common refrains from our community, which is a real and genuine refrain, is that they are taking someone away from their loved ones. So we really focused on the idea of how horrible it is to transfer people. And so then you see the governmental response. This is the Bush administration and then eventually the Obama administration. Well, the response is to build more detention facilities closer to home. And that was a continual response. And people in these facilities, like my client, like many of the people that I had the privilege of meeting, that members of Detention Watch Network, groups like Families for Freedom and others, were organizing inside these prisons, and their demands were very clear. They wanted to be released. They were also elevating the conditions that they were facing. And the reaction, the collective reaction, was often one about conditions. So the governmental reaction with the Obama administration, and we felt this in New York, was to really focus on reforming the detention system, again, by building more facilities, changing the nature of the facilities. And so in New York during these years, we see a proliferation of, we see some federal facilities, so Varick Detention Center, which is still an immigration court, but was a detention center, federally operated, but contracted out to a private company, Batavia, which is still here today in upstate New York. And then you see these county jails that are starting to cash in, and then a private prison in New Jersey. So starting from the 1980s to the 1990s, slowly the number of beds, as they call it, which I've also always found like a very disturbing way to count the way they fund detention, it just expands rapidly. And partially it is a response to this idea of like, well, we have to detain, but sure, we can keep people closer to home. And then people with all sorts of incentives trying to cash in on that. And so many of you have been part of this fight for many years. So you remember the horrific things that were happening in Passaic County in New Jersey, and the fight that was there to shut down end the contract and eventually to shut down that facility. We see it in Hudson in 1996, getting a contract. Bergen County, Monmouth had one, Essex County, in New York, Orange County. These are facilities that are essentially signing up to get money per person for detention at a time where our community, I think we were all struggling to figure out how to best protect our people from this machinery, and finding our words, our framing, being perverted by government officials to actually justify detention. And so we've learned a lot from that experience, and I think it's through the leadership of folks like Silky, who have done the hard work of bringing together organizations in our own community to expose the ways in which these reformist reforms can expand detention and get us to really shift our language. And so we were very excited at the Immigrant Rights Clinic when Tanya gave us a call one summer, having come from a Detention Watch Network meeting, to talk about what are we going to do as a community to actually try and end these contracts, to shut these facilities down. And so it's with that historical context of talking about the fact that, a lot of the work that we all do in our silos, there's a lot of good intention there within our own community, but it can still be used against us. And so the work of actually trying to organize to end, to stop these facilities from the expansion, to end the ones that are there, and to make sure it never happens again is a very challenging thing, and it's something that we've been very proud to be a part of. But again, I want to hand it over to the folks who really led the fight locally, so I'll stop there.
Yeah, that's incredible. Thank you, Alina. We're so lucky to have her on our side and in New York, really. So again, my name is Tania Matos, and growing up as undocumented in New York City, growing up in Jackson Heights. If you know Jackson Heights, it's a haven for immigrants, and I always felt that way. But for many, many years, there was always a fear that I had and my mother had, and I feel like a lot of immigrants, a lot of undocumented immigrants have, which is this fear of being detained, right? There's like a real like in your spine, like I don't want to be detained, I don't want to be sent back. And that's what really led to really pushing, really pushing for this movement, because honestly, I was tired of seeing raids happen in my community. I was so tired of seeing people, you see children losing their parents to being detained. It's just not right, and it's not humane. It's not how we should be treated. And so, I think some people come to being an abolitionist for, a variety of reasons, but that was my reason as to why I said this is enough, and it has to end. So I was very lucky enough to have gone to Colorado to the Detention Watch Network event. Thank you, Silky. And in one of the days that we were there, I heard that California was trying to pass a bill to end detention. And I said, well, wait a minute, why can't New York do that? So I decided to, get together with some of the people that I organize with here in New York, including like organizers from like Drum and other organizers. And I said, let's have a little meeting. So what do we think? And yeah, some people were like, let's have a conversation. Let's continue to have the conversation. So we went back to New York, and we started to have convenings, and people were very interested and curious. But I was not surprised, but I was. We were met with some resistance, and very warranted, right? Because it is people's lives that we're talking about, right? And people that are in detention. And so we had the example of California, but nobody's ever written how to end an immigration detention contract. So we just had to figure it out with the lessons that we have about, jail abolition. We were able, the lessons learned of many years they've been organizing for many years. So we were able to take some lessons from that movement. Yeah, we talked to organizations, we talked to legal organizations. I've seen at that time, many attorneys that represented these individuals were very passionate about their clients, and not really for this movement of ending detention. And like I said, they're very concerned about their clients, which is justified. But I think coming from that conference, I could see the vision that we can really build a national movement to end detention. And that's what sort of happened. But it took many years, a lot of literal blood, sweat, and tears into making it happen, right? And Sophia will talk about that end in terms of attorneys and all of her organizing that she's done. And, all these people on this panel have been extremely critical to the fight. And many of you all in the audience have also been very critical. And so we decided to continue with these convenings, and then COVID happened. And we turned to organizing online. And at that moment, we started organizing with New Jersey organizers, because a lot of the New York folks were being sent to New Jersey facilities like Hudson County Jail and Bergen and et cetera, but mostly Hudson County. And it was during a time where, social movement, Black Lives Matter, movement was really growing, and that really propelled, I feel, this campaign to end immigration detention, truly. And it was a lot to do with it. So simultaneously, so many things were happening: the pandemic, this movement growing, and then the organizers in New Jersey are no joke as well. Like, so they're incredible. But we knew we had to join forces. I know how New York organizers can be, but I felt we're very forceful, we're very territorial, but I felt it was very important for us for New Jersey to take the lead, because they know their community, they know their politicians, they know their county jails, they know, et cetera. So I really tried my best to really encourage people to listen to New Jersey activists. And then we were able to make our way to organizing with people inside of detention. And there was a moment where there was about to be a statewide immigration detention hunger strike. But that's when January 6th happened, and it got sort of not seen what was happening in detention centers in New Jersey, but there was a huge hunger strike that happened. And there's so many details. It's since 2018 to even now, so I can't go into all the details that happened. I'm really giving you the high points and also the low points. We had to build relationships with people inside, and that meant talking to people inside for hours and hours and every day, building relationships with them to build that trust, right? And obviously, they want to get out of detention. So we were doing participatory defense campaigns for each individual that was in there. And especially the people inside are extremely organized. There's a bunch of leaders in there. And they made it very clear to us that they rather risk their lives letting the public know the conditions of detention than being deported without anyone even noticing. So some people felt that way. A lot of people felt that way. And so they're the ones that organized the hunger strikes. They would tell us, and we took the lead from them, how can we support you when you do your hunger strikes, when you do your sit-ins, when you do all these actions, how can we support you? And it was very difficult, and it was not perfect. And even within the coalition, like I said, a lot of strong personalities. It felt like, a lot of back and forth, but somehow tumbling, we made it somehow tumbling all the way, right? There was rallies. We would have rallies outside of the detention facility. We would torture politicians. We'd go to their houses. In the middle of the night, we go to their fundraisers. Some people got arrested, some people, Bergen, and this is not just for Hudson County, it was for Bergen County, for Essex County, for Hudson County, for Elizabeth, and the fight for Elizabeth, shut down Elizabeth Detention Center, a private facility, continues. But it was all of these counties that we were able to, number one, pressure Senator Booker and Menendez to support the end of immigration detention, right? It wasn't because they had they were like, oh, I really love immigrants. It was because of the pressure that we put of people inside and outside. Even before a detention bill passed in New Jersey, or anti-detention bill passed in New Jersey, the counties exited the contract before a bill passed. So that is I pat ourselves on the back because that is pretty big. They exited the contract on their own because of the pressure that was put on them. Right? I'm very proud of that work of everyone who was involved with that, because that is not easy to force a sheriff to say, I don't want this contract anymore because it's not worth all the pain and torture that we put them through. And we felt like they deserved it because they treat our people so horribly. Horrible. There's torture that they torture people inside. And I'm saying that word, and it contains like 1,000 words and so many stories of your clients and so many people that we know that have gone through so much. So we won that part of the campaign. They passed the bill, detention facility, anti-detention bill, but the fight continues, right? The fight continues. We were able to do that in New Jersey. New Jersey is doing an incredible job as continuing to organize, and now we're in New York. Now we're in New York continuing the fight of ending the contract at Orange County Jail. Again, we are relentless as far as like the sheriff, the people around. We're organizing around the facility with immigrants. There's a lot of farm workers that live around the Orange County Jail. And again, that sheriff tortures the people, immigrant farm workers around there. So now we're building community in every county that has an ICE detention facility. We're building a community and organizing base in Troy, New York, upstate New York and Albany, in Orange County Jail in Middletown. And then we want to go all the way to Chautauqua, which is West New York. But there's everywhere in New York State, thank goodness, there's organizing bases that we're able to build a state movement. And it's not just about closing the jails, it's about making the immigrant rights movement stronger, and that can be anti-carceral, and connecting it with the anti-carceral movement. So.
Before Sophia talks, I wanted to just mention, so in the backdrop of this, so, Tanya and we're connecting about potentially supporting on efforts here and on Hudson County in particular, Detention Watch Network, this is 2018, this is sort of the summer of Abolish ICE and family separations, and Detention Watch Network is about to launch a campaign called Communities Not Cages, which is sort of an umbrella campaign to shut down detention centers, to stop the expansion of a lot of facilities, which is what was really happening a lot during the Trump era. And one of the big challenges is that here, because of that sort of access to Hudson County and the New Yorkers who were being sent there, there's actually resources to provide counsel. And a lot of lawyers here and legal organizations actually came out in support of keeping Hudson open. And it was a really hard moment for us because we were about to launch this campaign, and having New York City say, no, we want to keep detention was such a challenge. But over time that shifted. And I just wanted to give you that context. There's so much going on at the national level, and I feel like New York and New Jersey were such an important hotbed of activity to kind of create the conditions where more people could be asking for shutdown, and why the work that Tanya and so many people here did was so critical to the national fight. So I want to name that. And then, I think what was so exciting is actually there was this idea that all these organizations were for keeping the facility open, but that wasn't really totally true. So I'll pass it on to Sophia.
No, it was not. Hi, y'all. I'm Sophia. I work at the Bronx Defenders. I've been working at the Bronx Defenders since 2017. And before anything, I want to say, everyone at this table, I have learned tremendously from. These are very much powerhouse organizers in their own right. These are people who are making so many amazing moves happen in the immigrant justice movement. And I'm just honored to even be sitting up here with everyone, because I've been honored to learn from each of you at different points in my life. So as I said, I started in 2017. I started as a staff attorney. NIFUP stands for the New York Immigrant Family Unity Project, which is the first public defender program for detained immigrants and non-detained immigrants facing deportation, because unlike the criminal legal system, there is no right to counsel for folks facing deportation, despite the huge consequences of deportation and detention. And when I started, Trump was the president, and to be honest, being a staff attorney representing detained immigrants in general, but particularly during that time, was an incredibly radicalizing experience for me personally and professionally. And by 2018, I learned that the three different NIFUP organizations, the Legal Aid Society, the Bronx Defenders, which is where I work, as well as Brooklyn Defender Services, for some reason, were against ending a contract at Hudson County. And for further context, Hudson at the time was a place where I was representing a number of people who were detained. I was also representing people detained at Bergen County Jail, Essex County Jail, as well as Orange County Jail, which is still open today. And at the time, speaking for myself and as a union member, it really did not make sense to me why, as an institution and why, as public defenders representing detained immigrants, we would oppose ending a contract. Our job is to keep people out of jails and to get people out of jails and to make sure that they do not go back into jails. Our job is to reunite families. It is not to just be legal service providers who are providing services to people inside. That's how I've always understood my role. And it was really disheartening at the time that that was the position that we took, and that it was a position that was taken without really consulting the staff at the time. And mind you, in 2018, the Bronx Defenders is not actually unionized. We did not unionize until 2020. We were actually one of the original SCAB organizations that broke up the Association of Legal Aid Attorneys, which is now the union that we have returned to. So in 2018, there was this big budget hearing about this detention contract and whether or not it should end. And unfortunately, a number of the NIFUP providers testified in favor of keeping the contract. And to fast forward it to 2020, particularly during the 2020 George Floyd uprisings that were happening across the country, the mood changed dramatically in terms of how we thought about detention and the way that we thought about our own role as public defenders, defending people in various forms of carceral settings, whether it's within the criminal legal system or the immigration system or the family policing system, or people who are facing eviction from their homes. And because at the same time as these uprisings are occurring and the Bronx Defenders Union announces that we are going to unionize and that we are ready to unionize, a lot more possibilities became available to staff as well as to activists who are trying to continue to push to end that contract. Because as Tanya was talking about, people really are tortured within these facilities. They're still tortured. These are county jails that contract with ICE. And in many ways, these facilities, people tend, and Silky talks about this in her book, that people tend to focus on the private prisons and the private detention facilities as like the main centers of harm in the immigration detention system. But in my experience and in the experience of, countless immigrant New Yorkers who have been detained, that harm occurs within county jails that contract with ICE. So really in the tri-state area, a lot of the focus was around cutting those contracts as well as preventing future contracts from ever being signed. And around this time, I met Tanya, and we had a shared vision, though as Silky talks about in her book, there was a lot of tensions between the legal service providers and local immigrant justice advocates and activists, precisely because of what these organizations had done, which was really a slap in the face to the immigrant justice movement and in the area, as well as to the people that we defend. And it took time to build that relationship and to build that trust, and ultimately, it took a lot of internal staff organizing, because again, we're a union at this time, to actually push our various employers to change positions, because again, it really made no sense to a number of the staff, the frontline workers of the organization who are going to these detention facilities, who are litigating, the torture that people are experiencing within the facilities. It really made no sense to us why we would in any way want to prevent the ending of those contracts. We wanted everyone we represented to be free and everyone we didn't represent to be free, and we thought that there were legal mechanisms by which we could support that. And long story short, there ended up being a 12-hour hearing by the county commissioners that Abolish ICE New York, New Jersey did truly an amazing amount of organizing work, I would say over maybe the span of 72 hours, because they tried to basically rush this hearing and try to prevent any organizing to actually occur. And people testified that entire hearing against the extension of the contract. Literally every single person who testified for 12 hours was against. Yes, 100 people testified. And at the time, none of the NIAFA providers wanted to take a position, because it's very, I don't know if you've noticed, but a lot of nonprofits and universities and institutions like to take neutral positions on things. That was a thing back then as well. And it really, in my own personal and professional role, I could not testify at this hearing. And it was actually the first time that I ever did anything within my union capacity to testify at that hearing. And Silky graciously talks about this in the book, to point out that even though in 2018, the NIAFA providers kind of basically gave cover to the Hudson, what they were referred to as at the time as the Hudson County freeholders, basically the local legislature. And in that hearing, I made a point to be like, you are not doing the right thing. Because throughout that hearing, they often kept being like, oh, we're doing the right thing. We're keeping families together. The NIAFA provider said that this is the best thing to do. We should do that. And it felt really important as a frontline staff worker at one of these organizations to say no, that's not true. From what we were seeing, that people were continuously tortured, and at the time it was also the COVID-19 pandemic was in its first year, and it was, people were literally being held in solitary confinement for 23 and a half hours a day, and being told that it was for their own health and safety. And subsequently to that, we were connected via our union to other NIAFA providers who felt similarly, because at the time it was just the Bronx Defenders Union and me as a lowly Bronx Defenders Union member, speaking my mind, but obviously we realized we had to do more work beyond just one person speaking. And we connected with the immigration practice, the unionized members of the Legal Aid Society who work in the immigration practice, and we ended up doing a joint statement against that vote, because they did actually in that vote continue the contract and vote to continue it. And we continued to put pressure also and collaborate among unionized staff to push our own managements at these different organizations to say, you really need to rescind this policy that you had adopted without input from any of us. And that's ultimately how I would say 7 months later, not only did they do an entire 180 around, whether or not they should support the continuation of ICE detention, but they actually ended up endorsing at the launch of the bill, the Dignity Not Detention Act, which is a bill that Tanya was referring to, which is a New York State bill to end current ICE detention contracts as well as prohibit future detention contracts. And it really would have not been possible, one, if not for a union. I really advocate that people unionize your workplace while you still can. And two, without the collaboration with folks like Tanya, without the collaboration of folks like Alina, and without the folks inside, because there was a lot of organizing that was happening at that time in terms of hunger strikes, in terms of people sharing with their attorneys what the conditions were really like, and us as advocates doing our best to also continue to publicize that. If you look at knife up statements from around this time, there was efforts to uplift the hunger strikes that were ongoing, and through all of this collaboration between people inside, between activists, between academics, between everyone, we were able to do a 180. And now all of those legal service providers continue to support the Dignity Not Detention Act. And the Bronx Defenders is very involved in pushing that bill. And we're still trying to get it passed. But I'll stop there.
I will say, I lived in New York City for a long time, but now I live in Washington State. And I remember that hearing so well. I was watching online, and it was one of the most spectacular things I had ever seen. And I was texting Alina, and I was just like, what is going on? I cannot believe it. It was like 10 hours. It's nice to live on the West Coast because I didn't have to stay up as late. But when I was working on this book, I've been an organizer for many, many years. And I was just like, it's kind of boring because we're just in meetings all the time. How do I write about this? And I remember my writing coach was like, no, it's like how change happens. And I feel like this in particular, to go from the New York Immigrant Family Unity Project saying, keep this facility open, to actually signing on to support the Dignity Not Detention bill here in New York. And it's phenomenal to see that. And it's because people didn't give up. Like, they lost that hearing, but then 7 months later, actually those facilities are not in use. Mon's here a lot because part of what I'm doing with this book, I think sometimes people will just be like, oh, look, it's a book about detention abolition, or it's a book about border abolition, which it really isn't, but whatever. But the point of this book is to say, actually, it's not just like so much of the argument constantly is, well, let's separate the criminal legal system and immigration system and things will just get better. And it's like, well, no, that's not actually how it works. And what I saw, what we all witnessed very, very clearly, both in this particular case study, but in general, the moment when we had the most ability to make the case for detention abolition was the summer of 2020. That was the moment when people started seeing the bigger picture. And so it's not, and again, this is why I say it's not just, a lens and a guide. It's actually like essential to have that bigger frame to get us closer to where we want to go. And I think in New York, these sort of conversations, especially around what was happening in jails in the city, was so live throughout this process. And I wonder, Mon, if you can just sort of share a little bit about like what's happening during that period and how that influences this conversation.
Yeah, definitely. I'm Mon. I was one of the co-founders of the No New Jails National Network and also am one of the community organizers at Community Justice Exchange. I cannot recommend the book enough and am so excited that, along with Alina's book, actually, two resources exist that kind of accomplish the de-siloing that you're talking about, Silky. I guess before I get into what happened starting 2018, I will provide a little bit of context about what might have happened in the 1930s, because I think it's important to understand New York City jails now based on what was happening back then in the 30s and 60s. In the 30s, New York City opened Rikers Island as a response to the kind of violence that was taking place inside New York City jails. So particularly Blackwell's Island, which was a penitentiary in New York that was that was used to cage migrants, and it was used to cage sex workers and people who were seen as sort of like surplus to an upcoming sort of metropolitan city. And I think that's a really important part of this story, and it's something that organizers who have been trying to close Rikers have talked about at length, because Rikers was opened as a response to another facility. And that's just the cycle that keeps continuing from on and on and on. And it's something that we're hearing also, I think, in around like jails and contracts and detention centers, where the cycle often is, we can't just close a thing. or we can't just end this thing, we can't just demolish this thing, we have to open something else, we have to create some other kind of program, we have to introduce some other form of social control. During the 30s to the 60s, Rikers became this hotbed of organizing because New York City completely expanded. It expanded the number of people it was actually holding inside jails. That's where we got the other jails, the Tombs, which is in Chinatown, which people might have heard of, the Queens, the Kew Garden facility, the Boat, which has now closed. All of these have been closed, although, as we get to the later part of the story, it's not great news. But though, you know, and also they opened the Women's Detention Center, which also closed in the 70s. But all of these were opened each time because people were organizing inside to name that the conditions were incredibly bad. So there's a lot of lessons here about inside organizing and also about the rebellions that people were holding inside to demand not just, you know, better sentencing or bail reform, but also extradition and amnesty. All kinds of like radical organizing was happening between the 30s and 60s inside New York City's jails and all of the jails across the state also. Those were the kinds of rebellions that actually fueled rebellions in places like Attica. So there was a direct legacy of sort of like radical organizing in New York City that was like fueling radical organizing around the country. In the 60s, after New York City sort of had this historic overcrowding, you know, what they call overcrowding, but it's really just like they have jails and they shouldn't have them. But what was considered overcrowding led to the city, and particularly organizations that then come back up in the story now in 2024, but in the 50s and 60s, organizations like the Vera Institute were part of creating ways to basically supervise people and what they called alternatives to incarceration, what they called decarceration at the time. But that moment in the 60s was really important because at this time of like immense rebellion, you had administrators, nonprofits, all kinds of organizations thinking about how to not close a jail, essentially. How to not close a jail and then create other kinds of systems to justify not closing the jail. And then how to do all kinds of like rhetorical, bureaucratic sort of like lawmaking and all kinds of things to justify then not closing the jail and incarcerating people in other ways. All of this kind of gets us to the 2010s, where in between, you know, part of the point of this history is that people haven't been trying to close Rikers since 2015. People have been trying to close Rikers since the 1930s, and they were trying to close Rikers, you know, they were trying to close Blackwells before the 1930s. And I think it speaks to the history that Tanya was talking about, that there's this just like legacy of organizing to shut down without new construction, without reforms, you know, in around prison abolition. In the 2010s, Bill de Blasio, awful mayor, not as awful as our current one somehow, but finally came around, you know, after basically years of being like, we will not close Rikers. Rikers can't be closed. There's no solution we have for closing Rikers, even though, you know, again, people since the 70s had been like, it's constitutionally not even viable anymore. Bill de Blasio, after the death of Khalif Browder, who was held on a $1 bail for a year, he died after leaving Rikers. Bill de Blasio, there was a lot of organizing to try with, the organization was called Jails Justice Coalition. There were a couple of different organizations that really organized to try and get Rikers closed. But it was only when a couple of different organizations, and particularly contractors, architectural contractors, and different jail assessment companies, private companies, presented Bill de Blasio with a plan to close Rikers by building 4 new jails, smaller facilities, they said, that he really saw a kind of monetary opportunity in building 4 new jails and closing Rikers. So that's how we got the borough-based jails plan, and that's the context I think Silky was talking about that is relevant to sort of what was happening with the Hudson facility and what happened in 2020. Sophia and I were both organizers against the construction of the 4 borough-based jails. That campaign was called the No New Jails campaign. It was No New Jails New York City. That was one of, I think, you know, at this point, like 20, 30 different campaigns across the country that people have launched to fight local jail construction or to shut down local jails. The argument that Noni Jails was making was that, and Alina kind of alluded to this, just because you're reducing the number of beds inside a building doesn't mean you're removing the source of the violence. It's the same correctional officers, it's the same city, it's the same logic. Silky sort of talked about it at the beginning, which is that it's the same cycle of sort of anti-Black racism and eugenics that was like showing up at the beginning with like the construction of Rikers, coming back now with the construction of these 4 borough-based jails, which I think would be one of the most expensive jail construction projects in the country, and if not just now, probably one of the most expensive ever. They're going to cost up to potentially $16 billion. I think the other sort of aspect of this that is really important is the No New Jails New York City campaign didn't win, but there were a lot of connections forged in the organizing around closing down Rikers and then around why the city was not supporting people. You know, we were going into the streets asking people, what would you do with $11 billion? And that sort of moment where people were sort of like thinking about, oh, well, I don't want a jail. You know, it didn't just stop at the jail. It was stopping, it went on to thinking about detention centers. It went on to thinking about all kinds of carceral facilities in their community. And I think that even though No New Jails, New York City didn't successfully stop the construction of the borough-based jails, there was a lot of consciousness raised and a lot of awareness formed that I think has contributed to the way that the fights have gone on in New York City. Yeah.
We can talk a little bit about at the end about some of the things that folks can do to get involved and support both the Dignity Not Detention campaign here in New York, but also there's an effort to expand detention again in New Jersey right now that folks are really which is really live. And the one thing I just want to say about all this, and I write about this, Detention Watch Network and Immigrant Legal Resource Center did a study that sort of, you know, I think this sort of question, like a lot of this was about this point that people would be transferred to other parts of the country if we closed down a jail. And sort of what we discovered actually is that whenever you have detention in an area, there's actually more incentive for ICE to target people in that community. And so a lot of what we were showing was like, actually, yes, some people will probably be transferred. None of this is perfect. These systems are really harmful. Bringing them down is not going to be a perfect process, and I think it's really hard for people to accept, especially lawyers. But I think that the point is that we want to really reduce the harm as much as possible, and through some of these sanctuary policies, through ending these detention contracts, you have seen, like I said earlier, those formal deportations start to go down, and you see that really meaningfully. So I want to fast forward to now. I mean, New York is really, New York is always a lot of the center of attention, but partly it's the center of attention right now in the immigration conversation because the Texas governor, I'm from Texas, the governor of my home state, Greg Abbott, is basically completely dictating immigration policy right now because the Democrats have absolutely no vision, absolutely no strategy, absolutely no desire to actually do anything for immigrants in a lot of ways. And so it's been a really, really hard moment, and New York City has been at the center of this conversation, also Denver, Chicago, other places. But, you know, this real, like, sort of question about the post-pandemic or current pandemic, but, you know, the kind of pandemic era, like destruction of social safety nets and how that's impacting communities, and also how, you know, you have migrants being bused from Texas and the resources aren't there, even though a decade ago, actually, New York had the resources and similar numbers were coming and there was like a possibility to kind of support people. Those things have really sort of waned at this point, and there's been a backlash, there's been a sort of move to the right, and we're negotiating a lot of that, and folks here are negotiating, and I thought it would be good for us to talk a little bit about what's happening with the busing, how things have shifted since 2020, 2021, when there was sort of opportunity to scale back on detention, to really think about a sort of pro-immigrant stance. And I wanted to see if, I mean, anyone who wants to respond, but I wanted to see if folks could both respond to, you know, how things have shifted and kind of give a little bit of the background. I mean, you mentioned Eric Adams, and, you know, how organizers are responding, actually. So I think both of those are the questions. I don't know if who wants to start.
I can start because 7 months ago, I started running an immigrant legal services organization in the middle of everything happening. We're small but mighty organization, and it is extremely overwhelming. You know, we have people who are requesting our services all day. People come to the office, call us, email us, like just, you know, there's just so much need. We're not able to keep up, or no nonprofit who does legal services, immigration legal services, is able to keep up with the amount of demand that's out there. I will say, you know, when immigrants started to come to New York via bus, I think the reaction it was really amazing to see how New Yorkers were able to respond quickly to the buses coming and welcoming people. It was not perfect situation, but there was a lot of mutual aid happening, as you all know and have seen. Unfortunately, there's a lot of anti-immigrant rhetoric happening right now. And on the policy end for digging out detention and other bills like New York for All, and you know, at the city level, at the state level, you know, it's a very anti-immigrant moment right now, where no progressive bills are able to pass, including digging out detention through the legislation. That's why we decided to focus more on organizing, because it's a moment to kind of, even though we're completely democratically controlled, from the president to the mayor, it's a moment we feel like we have to, at least for me, feel like we have to hunker down and organize and build power and maintain that power together. You know, and within the legal services orgs, a lot is happening as well, and but we try to keep our eye on serving people in the right way, meaning that people get the dignified services for them. But you know, while I'm doing this work, like, we also have to think about the big picture, about how can we move forward, how can we change the narrative. I think that's been very difficult for immigrant rights organizers in New York, to try to change the narrative in New York amongst even our family members, right? Even immigrants themselves. There's a lot of misconception and myths that people are hearing, and there's a lot of anger. And I think it is, in a way, it is right, because immigrants and working class communities and poor communities have been shortchanged for such a long time, right? Housing has always been an issue here, policing, so many issues. We've been really shortchanged, and I think we're not directing it at the right people. We should be directing it to the government. So I'll end there. Yeah.
Yeah, I think in so many ways, you know, a lot of what you see is that, like, the problem is social inequality. The problem is that people don't have the resources that they need, that there's been a destruction of the welfare state, all those things. And immigrants become the scapegoat. And we sort of always know this, but it's like they still just keep doing it. And it's a constant negotiation for our work. But yeah, I don't know if
in terms as an attorney representing detained people, oftentimes we represent people who will go into their ICE check-ins, people who were bussed up from Texas usually, and because of their contact with the criminal legal system, whether in the United States or in the country that they were living in prior to arriving in the United States, ICE will unilaterally arrest people in front of their family members at these check-ins. And I've noticed that ICE is also continuing to designate people more as mandatorily detained, as a, quote, arriving alien. Silky talks a lot about 236 and mandatory detention, and the other mandatory detention statutes. And it's devastating. I mean, representing people who have no access to any sort of real due process, even though due process is like really just a suggestion in immigration court. They don't even have access to that, and to continue to see people to physically, mentally, emotionally, spiritually deteriorate in ICE detention in facilities like the Orange County Jail is devastating. But I wanted to specifically talk about the way that Democrats in particular in New York State are really following the same playbook that Silky gets into in the book of demonizing immigrants and using this paradigm of good immigrant or bad immigrant, and something that we continue to see happen. We see the targeting of people who've had contact with the police, who've resisted the police, as being, put all over the New York Post or put all over the media as examples of like why we shouldn't be welcoming immigrants. And we also see, kind of to what Tanya was talking about, the way that even within immigrant communities, there is this growing divide of, well, we've been here longer, why should we be helping these folks? Or I'm not a criminal, I haven't had any contact with the criminal legal system, so why, like these folks have, so they should be disposed of. And what I really appreciate about Silky's book, and why I really think people should read it, is she really unpacks just how damaging that is. And this is why the abolitionist framework is so critical to the immigrant justice movement. She also gets into the book like the way that even the nonprofit organizations perpetuate these stereotypes through comprehensive immigration reform for decades, to be honest. And we really need to let that go, because we can only win if we're fighting for all of us. And if we don't understand that criminalization is a tool of anti-Black racism and anti-Indigenous racism, then we're going to keep losing. We really need to be pushing back against policing. We need to be pushing back against criminalization, meaning like prosecutions and criminal incarceration itself, and understanding that these systems really are interrelated. And if we continue to dehumanize people because of their contact with the criminal legal system, we're only going to keep losing. So please read Silky's book. She gets into it.
I think I was just going to add one thing, which is because we were talking about 2020. During 2020, there were one of the big demands was whether it was defund or abolish. One of the big demands was we want resources in the communities. We don't want jails, or we don't want cages. We want different kinds of like support for teachers, or we want libraries, or some funding for parks and things like that. And I think particularly, this is the case in New York for sure, but I think around the country too. The demonizing of immigrants based on either their level, just based on this, like as like a kind of like the othering of them as like taking more from the city, or the demonizing of them as criminals, I think is a direct response to these demands for like more resources into the community. Because one of the things that Eric Adams has continued to say, and like Governor Kathy Hochul has continued to say, is that one of the reasons that New York City cannot provide all of those things that were demanded in 2020 is because of this busing of migrants and because of the entry of migrants. And there's a direct relationship there between, what people were demanding during the 2020 uprisings and how the manipulation of this narrative and the governments of New York City and New York State needed a crime wave. And they've basically invented a crime wave by turning migrants into the source of that crime wave.
Yeah, no, I agree with all of that. And I think one of the things that's been so painful is that there was such immediately a narrative of burden, like from every segment of the New York City community, and the way it's covered in the media, even by people who try to be thoughtful about like situations like this language of scarcity, and that, there's only so much, the othering effect. And it's just such a game of smoke and mirrors, which you talk about in the book. People are able to be distracted from the fact that, people are not able to work as freely as they could because work authorization is legally taken from them, because we've passed laws to create this problem. And then there's a narrative of people not following the law and somehow, trying to take benefits that aren't there. So I think like thinking about ways that we shift from this narrative of scarcity to one of abundance. And, I think the mutual aid efforts were really beautiful. And it feels hard to think about it critically because we're so much still in it. But people have been very successful in taking what has been good, what has been powerful, and then just dividing folks into groups where you feel like you're fighting for scraps. And I think that there seems to be a real absence of leadership. And I think, frankly, it's really frustrating. And I can't imagine being someone who has to have a lot of DC-based conversations about how people who are on message and on point when Trump was the face of a lot of these things. And I think that is why Hudson, the freeholders, were willing to say, "Oh, we're considering ending this contract." It's not because, they learned new information about what was happening in their jails, but because they were realizing people were thinking of them as folks involved in family separation, that the abolish ICE movement was taking steam. Nothing had changed based on their knowledge or what they were doing. It was always horrific. And then as soon as Trump left, which is what everyone predicted, or left for whatever, that suddenly all of those allies had disappeared, or potential allies. So I'm sorry, can we ask you a question? New York as a microcosm for things that you're hearing in DC, and Adams as an example of the Democrats, because I think we've been really amazed by the hard work of folks on the ground who have shut down facilities and ended contracts, but also devastated by the fact that the best opportunity to fundamentally end immigration detention when COVID really lowered the numbers, and people and forces that we did not like were also lowering the numbers of people who are in detention because of all the border it was the moment to close it down. And you had a plan. People had a plan. They wrote the plans. They shared the plans. And then it didn't, so sorry, I don't know if we're allowed to ask you a question, but.
The question is how to, well, okay, so the thing I'll say is, I mean, I don't know. When I was writing this book, I was like, oh, this is kind of coming too late. Everyone knows all this already and whatever. And then, of course, all the things that Mon was just talking about, I was like, oh, actually, no, we're just right back in it. We're right back in all of this stuff. And I think the thing I hold on to is, even where I live in Washington State, actually when at the Northwest Detention Center in Tacoma, which has a guaranteed minimum that says a certain number, or a certain amount of money will be given to the GO group for having this detention center. Actually, so many of the people in the facility are actually not people from Washington State or the Pacific Northwest. It's actually people who are being flown from the southern border. And the reality is, still, when you look at the detention system, maybe 25% or so are people who were targeted community members here and who are currently here, and 75% are actually mostly people who are apprehended at the border, and that's been a shift over time. And so I want to still hold on to how important those wins are, because the reality is that that period of time during the Obama years and the Bush years, when I started doing this work, when many of us, were in it, it was so hard for immigrant communities. People were being taken, rampant deportations were happening, detention grew significantly, and it's actually not politically popular to do that in the same way. So I want to hold on to that, and it's so important to hold on to that. I'm not saying that things are perfect, because things are quite bad. And in fact, part of the reason why it's so important for us to go after the full system is that the majority of people who are targeted in the interior are actually being funneled through the prison and jail system. And so that's so important. The thing I would say about, on the Abbott piece, and I write about this at the end, he has this program called Operation Lone Star, which is, just like there's this other program called Operation Streamline, which is the opposite of due process, where mass prosecutions were happening on the border, and it's kind of just on steroids. It's wild what's happening in Texas right now. They also passed a bill that said people could get 10 years in prison for quote unquote smuggling. And this is the other thing that sort of happens. Like all these restrictionist policies happen on the border, and this like, oh, we have to stop the smuggling and the trafficking. And it's actually like, no, these are the policies that are allowing immigrants to be exploited. And it's really unpacking the criminal legal system and how it operates. And so from my perspective, and for so many years, the immigrant rights movement, I mean, Democrats really, but also the immigrant rights movement, through this sort of emphasis on the good immigrant versus bad immigrant, which is also sort of the old immigrant versus the new immigrant, and really honing in on the people who live here, which we need to do, and we need to do everything we can to support at the expense of people who are coming and the expense of people who are criminalized, has ceded so much ground. And we have, I think right now it's so critical that we actually we have to start seeding that vision for what freedom of movement looks like, what it looks like to not have a militarized border, what it looks like to, I think right now, and we can talk about this, I do want to open it up for questions, but, seeing the solidarity around what's happening in Gaza, what's happening in Palestine right now, and seeing how actually there's so much connection between the systems of control at the border and Gaza being a laboratory for so much of that. This movement has been so patriotic, and this movement, really like a lot of lobbyists in DCs, but a lot of other folks too have sort of bought into this idea of immigrants have to be really American and really patriotic and good and productive and useful and all these other things. And we've moved away from this sort of understanding of why people are coming, the root causes of migration, a sort of internationalist connection to what is happening. And I think this is a moment where we actually have a lot of opportunity to push the ideas of freedom of movement, freedom to stay, freedom to move. And I think, we don't have all the answers right now, but I think the hope is with abolition as a guide, with sort of kind of expanding beyond sort of these frameworks, we can actually start to do that. It's going to be a long haul fight. We're going to be in this for the long haul, but like it's so desperate that we do that now. So that's what I would say. And yeah. Okay. We are running out of time, so I wanted to see if there was a couple questions from the audience. Yes. Oh, they've got one there.
Testing? Okay. Even though I could yell and scream at everyone, this is better. First of all, I don't know if it's Miss Shah or Mrs. Shah, which is interesting because in one of my eloquent deliberations with two of your co-panelists there, I mentioned the Shah of Iran. So the Shah spirit is lingering somewhere in here. Congratulations on your book, as well as Alina's book. I remember her big festive thing they did also. You mentioned the lawyer. What is your name again? Sophia. You mentioned something very interesting to the point that I was, this is going to be redundant for you all because I mentioned what I was going to state here. But for everyone else, I think the issue of all the nonprofits that I've been involved in, and even not been involved in, is that their charter precludes actual taking power. So that would answer the question of why all these organizations are neutral, because at the end of the day, they're either taking money from the government funding or from Wall Street or private funders / Wall Street funding. And so it's not part of their charter to take power. And the problem with that is, as you just, adumbrated, if we all live to be another 100 years, we're all going to be in here talking about the same thing. And ICE is going to be 3 times as bigger, and they're going to have $1 trillion budget, right? So the issue, I'm in the People's Party. We got, and the political term is rat-fucked. We got rat-fucked by Dr. Cornel West. He does great jobs on Palestine, black issues, but we were trying to do it in a form of taking power and addressing the system. Because that's the thing. It's not in the charter of many of the non-for-profits to create a new political party that doesn't accept corporate money and challenges the establishment, and we have our own bylaws. It's not in the organization's charter to do this. And so there's a glass ceiling that's there. No matter how great advocates we are, how much different, it's a hydra. You close 3 facilities, they open up 300 more. They open up black sites. And this is all tied in on the jackbooted thug alphabet soup, spook spy level of these 3-letter agencies that the president has full control over. And it's a uniparty, right? You just saw with, what's his face there, that the Speaker of the House, whatever his name is, the Democrats and the Republicans came together to keep him there so they could continue the genocide, so they can continue the mass incarceration, so they can continue the pain. And there's none of us that's actually challenging that in a way that we need to. Like Britain, I don't know if you know George Galloway and the Workers' Party, he got back into Parliament. They have 500 representatives up and down through the aisle that's getting ready to challenge that uniparty. We don't have that here, and that's what we need. So it's not to shit on anybody's work. It's just that if you want to change the system, speaking truth to power, power ignores you. You're just shooting arrows at the castle wall. We need to be in there. Because and I'll just finish with this, as always, if we're not at the table where the policies and these things are being made, then we're on the menu. And for far too long, we've been on the menu since 1996, or if you're like me, 1979, I've been on the menu. So this is just what I wanted to add to the pieces that's missing. The organizations that you're a part of, because they take certain funding, it's not part of their charter to actually challenge the establishment. And so, thank you.
Just briefly off of that, that's why unions matter.
Yes.
Because if you want to take power from these institutions, you need to have organized, unionized workers by which to do that. That's how the Bronx Defenders ended up changing its position, was because of the unions. That's why you see a lot of unions right now, particularly around Palestine, including the Bronx Defenders Union, issuing statements in support of Palestinian liberation. So I agree, and I also think that unions are what have to step in and actually withhold labor and actually prevent, at least in the context of Palestine, the arming and shipping and manufacturing and designing of weapons in Gaza. And I also think that it's important for folks that are working within these institutions, and I'll speak just about mine, to understand the way that the work that we do is tied to this international lens. Like, for example, when talking about mandatory detention, I think oftentimes about Palestinians who are being held, there's like 10,000 Palestinians who are held in what's called administrative detention, which to me really sounds a lot like 236C mandatory detention, which is that you can be held for up to 6 months without any meaningful due process, and then the IOF and the Israeli government can decide, okay, well, we're going to keep you in even longer, and there's really no due process whatsoever. So I think, we need to be constantly seeing and understanding the way that these things are mirroring each other. And I think it also applies to the border. A lot of the technology that is used and developed in Palestine against Palestinians by Israel is the same technology that's being used at the US-Mexico border. So I think we do have to keep expanding the way that we think about these systems, and rather than just thinking about it as it's an over there problem, it's a problem for all of us.
Thank you for that. I think we have 2 more questions, and we'll probably have to wrap up soon, but.
Peace and blessings, everyone. I'm Dara Baldwin. I want to say, first of all, thank you for your book. I haven't read it yet, but I can't wait to read it. And thank you for this panel. I just have, so quick, my sister Mon, I just want to say for you, I love what you do in your work, but Khalid did not die. He killed himself. So I just want, when you speak about him, let's speak the truth about him. I know you know this, but when you say he died, that's right, he killed himself. I just want to put that forward. And I know you know this. We have to bring that into the place, right? He committed suicide, right? So, and I'm a disability activist, so the language there. But and then just wanted to ask, and bring to this space, because I know you have it, Silky, but it hasn't been discussed here, the conversation between Black immigrants and how they feel about abolitionism, and even the abolition movement, and I've had this conversation with many of them, is just to shut down prisons and jails, right? Even Angela Davis, we've had this conversation, and you talked about it here. For us, right, it's mental health institutions, nursing homes, right? Any carceral state, teenage, those places where they send teens to troubled teens centers, foster care centers, right? And so we have to bring that into this space. And then because I do disabilities, I did want you to touch on that, the torture and the things that happen to people in these facilities. And we as disability activists have always tried to be there for, people act like immigrants don't have disabilities. It's really interesting when you have these, I know you're looking at, seriously, in DC, yeah, no, it's like, oh, really? Well, the ADA doesn't apply to them because it's for Americans with disabilities. And I go, no, there's case law, right? The IDEA, Individuals with Disability Education Act, is for American children, not the immigrant children. So I just wanted to touch on that.
Thank you so much. And I do think, in that sort of long history, actually so much immigration policy and law and like exclusion of immigrants has been, okay, we're going to exclude Chinese, we're going to exclude Asians. Also, we're going to exclude people with illness and disability and mental health. So all those things are actually very much embedded in the system. And even when you look at these facilities, I think about the Berks Detention Center in Pennsylvania, which was a former nursing home turned into a family detention center, and similarly, Gina in Louisiana was a juvenile detention center. Like, all these things are recycled over and over again. And there's actually, and I think GEO even has a subsidiary that has mental health institutions. So it's deeply, deeply connected. And yeah, I don't know if you wanted to touch on that.
Yeah, I was going to touch on that. And thanks for saying that about Khalif. I'm always like, how explicit should I be? So thank you for naming that. I think one thing I didn't get to name earlier, and if we were talking specifically about county jails and jails in particular, the entire expansion now of county jails and jails is based on asylums and is based on psychiatric incarceration. So it's if we're de-siloing between the criminalization of people inside jails and prisons and in the prison industrial complex, and between what happens to people at the border, what happens to people in migrant detention facilities, we're also de-siloing, I think, between what happens to people inside psychiatric facilities. In New York, actually, the jails that, the borough-based jails that I was just talking about, half of them is about the buildings. The entirely half of them is about expanding supervision, which is entirely based on what was done to people inside asylums and mental health facilities. And so I feel like there's all these connections that speak to what Silky talks about in the book around it's never just the jail, it's never just the detention facility, it's never just the nursing home, it's never just the psychiatric facility. These are all systems of caging and of entrapment.
Thank you for that. And I just wanted to add, because Alina, when you brought up beds, because when you said that, that's where that came from, right? Is that Medicaid, Medicare, the way in which you get paid is at 1201, the bed count, how many people are in a hospital. That's right. That's why ER, they try to keep you. They say, oh, no, you're okay, but we're just going to keep you here to 1230, because at 1201, they have to have that count, right? Or I'm sorry, they try to get you upstairs. Bed them, ER is either get them up to bed or street them. So they try to get you in a bed by 1201, because that's when Medicare and Medicaid count. They say, how many beds did you have at 1201? And that's how they get paid. So that's where the bed count came in, which comes from, right, this whole system of incarcerating disabled people and putting people into institutions.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much for that. I think we have one more question and then we'll wrap up, but we'll hang out.
I'm so happy to see you, Silky. We spoke in Texas, when I was in Texas, and I just appreciate I can't wait to read your book. I appreciate all of your work. I'm coming here as, I'm an educator, but I also am just thinking about my neighborhood. I live on the Lower East Side, and we have like 200 guys from Cameroon and other parts of Africa. When I did a little bit of work on receiving people, just offering translation skills, I was just shocked at who's coming. It's just people from all these, like, displacement, probably due to climate, probably due to narco politics. I mean, I want to hear a bit more about, like, what is pushing all these people out of these places, because it seems like another way to make a connection. That is, like, how can the climate justice movement be connected to this movement? And then the other question is about, because I'm an educator and we have a STEP program in the prisons in New Jersey. And I'm so excited about that because, you know, it's for a long time you couldn't get a degree when you were in jail. And I'm just wondering, is there any kind of program so that people in detention can we teach people in detention centers? Does that exist? So random questions. Thank you for your work. I can't wait to read your book.
No, they do nothing for immigrants in detention facilities. And Silky's book gets into this. The argument is basically because people are going to be deported, why would there be any services provided to people inside? So for example, at the Orange County Jail, for a long time, there were those types of programs for folks on the criminal side of people who were held in criminal custody in Orange County Jail, but then for folks held in the ICE side of the jail, they didn't have access to any of those things. A lot of those services, I think, were like totally abolished after the COVID-19 pandemic started. I may be wrong about that, but what I really appreciate about Silky's book is that she gets into also why even providing those services are not sufficient for people inside ICE detention, though I do know a number of people who would love to have programming because they are wasting away for months, intentionally wasting away because of the US government. And I think that's really something that I've heard folks articulate to me, is that it's the not knowing when, if ever, you're going to be released, and just languishing, not knowing when, and then having no access to any sort of supportive services. In terms of what's, I'll stop after this because I know people have their own opinions, but in terms of what's driving migration, a lot of it just has to do with like the exploitation of the global South by Western countries and U.S. imperialism. I mean, the majority of people that I have represented in ICE detention and fought their deportation cases are folks who are fleeing either because of economic insecurity, just simply not having a job or having any way to make money for their family, or they're fleeing violence that was directly supported by the United States government, whether it's in El Salvador or Colombia, or even in Chile or in Mexico. Yeah, I'll stop there.
I think we're going to wrap up, but I wanted to turn it to Tanya to tell us a little bit about the work that people are doing right now in New York and how you might be able to get involved, and then we'll wrap up.
Yeah, thank you, Silky. So on your seat, you should have a QR code where you can scan, and you'll be sent to a link tree that has our website. You can endorse the Dignity Not Detention campaign as an individual and as an organization. And there's plenty of resources there that you can read. There's also a one-pager at the front, right over there, where you can get some information about what is the Dignity Not Detention bill. And if you want to, once you sign up as an individual, if you want to get involved, we're going up to Orange County to do legal consultations and organizing with people in that area, like I mentioned before, with farm workers and people, restaurant workers. There's an organized community there. So we're doing the work of organizing folks there, with them. And then, if you want to go up to Albany with us, you can also do that. So thank you so much for taking the time to take a look at the QR code. And if you'd like to donate as well to commissary funds, 100% of your donations go to the commissary funds of people in Orange County Jail. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And there's also there's a lot of QR codes. There's information about DW, Detention Watch Network. I have a few colleagues here, which is really wonderful. Thank you all so much. I thank you all for joining. I just am so inspired by all of you. It was amazing to that. Again, the work that's happened here has been so critical to our national efforts to end detention and has inspired so many groups across the country. And I have a lot of gratitude to y'all for it. And New York, It's not the center of the world, but to some degree, to some degree, it sometimes is. So a really, really important place to really see these fights and push this. And thank you all so much for joining us tonight. And there, if you want to buy a book, you can buy it here. It's here.
And just a big shout out to all the groups that have been part of Dignity Not Detention, Campaign to Abolish ICE, New York, New Jersey, the grassroots groups, the large groups. Surge is here, DSA, like just, DWN, just so many organizations have been, and individuals have been part of this whole movement. So this is just a tiny, tiny piece of folks here that have been involved. Hundreds and hundreds of people have been involved in this movement. So thank you, everybody.